So, the past 2 days in here, we've been basically delving into the history of conflict and tensions between the Irish and English people, something that basically dates back, hundreds and hundreds of years, and has definitely seen kind of its ebbs and flows, its spikes in violence, but it's also its periods of cooperation and some level of easing of tensions. Well, today we're going to kind of build off of those initial lessons by looking at something that basically wraps up almost at the cusp of your lifetime. A period of tremendous violence and other social problems that we see specifically in Northern Ireland from the 1960s through the 1990s, specifically a period of time known as the Troubles. And the Troubles, are something that I think the best way to kind of characterize it is that it was a solid 3 decades of kind of tit for tat revenge violence between major paramilitary groups. You had groups that were composed of people of Irish Catholic descent, oftentimes carrying out attacks against people of British Protestant descent, and vice versa. I always say to people your age that when I was young, if somebody said the word terrorism to me or terrorist, I didn't envision somebody from the Middle East. I didn't think about something like Islam or Al Qaeda or 9/11. That wasn't the vision of terrorism I had in my mind. Instead, the version of terrorism that I saw was what was playing out in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Oftentimes, Irish or British paramilitary groups, oftentimes clad in camouflage and ski masks, armed with Uzis or automatic rifles, gunning down people in pubs, or carrying out bombing attacks or political assassinations. That was terrorism to me for the first few decades of my life. Now, when I say that it's kind of tit for tat violence, again, one thing that's important to kind of understand contextually here is that, there had been paramilitary groups, there have been militia groups, private organized military groups that have been forming in Northern Ireland dating back to the late 19th century. In fact, I think I had mentioned in our last lesson how, especially in the context of the 1921 partition, there were a number of militant groups that were either fighting against the British government or fighting amongst themselves, either to preserve the unity of the North with the United Kingdom or to try to rejoin it with the rest of the island. Well, those desires of these military groups, continued beyond the partition period. Continued beyond the independence of the Republic of Ireland in 1949. And what we see in Northern Ireland, specifically in the 1960s, was a situation where you had people increasingly turning to violence and terror to try to promote their political ends. In addition to this, one thing that we cannot overlook as a kind of major underlying cause of the Troubles was the fact that post-partition in 1921, that the government of Northern Ireland was extremely prejudicial against the Irish Catholic minority there. Since people of British Protestant descent generally made up the majority of the population, they basically had all of the power in the government. And so things like funding bills, the money was generally channeled into British neighborhoods, or, bills that were meant to promote economic development, again, generally, spent on British Protestant areas, oftentimes at the expense of their Catholic neighbors. So this was just something that kind of continually, stoked the coals, if you will, of kind of, increased tensions within that part of the British Empire. Now, again, when we look at the paramilitary groups, there was lots. Okay, there was lots on both sides. Many paramilitary groups were extremely small and kind of close knit. A lot of them were very regionally based. So, like in one town, they might have their groups, and in another town, they would have different groups, and they wouldn't be affiliated with each other whatsoever. But we do see that there were kind of two dominant groups, two kind of standard bearers that were responsible for the vast majority of the violent actions during this 3-decade period of time. On the Irish Catholic side, you had a group called the IRA. And no, I don't mean the individual retirement accounts, not that kind of IRA. I am talking the IRA as in the Irish Republican Army. Okay, and anytime that you see in the context of Anglo-Irish issues a reference to somebody being a Republican, that is a reference to the Republic of Ireland, that separate independent country. So the IRA, wanted the British out. They wanted to rejoin with the rest of the island as one independent country. These visuals, why I always include these in any kind of discussion of the Troubles or violence in Northern Ireland, is the fact that these images, many of them still exist today. What was very, very common during the Troubles is that oftentimes these paramilitary groups would almost kind of mark off their territory. And when I say mark off their territory, I mean, basically what we increasingly see during the Troubles is that Northern Ireland becomes a very segregated society. Previously you had, mixed areas where you had Protestants and Catholics living kind of next to one another side by side. Well, by the time you get to the Troubles, if you were, a Protestant living in a mostly Catholic area, you were generally targeted. You were targeted, you were driven out, and almost overnight, these neighborhoods become kind of completely homogeneous, from each other. The other thing too is that, because of the use of terror and violence, many of these areas basically became no-go zones for legitimate, government security. So, the police, later on the British military, if they knew an area was an IRA patrolled neighborhood or a Catholic area, oftentimes that was a very dicey place to go. If you walked in, you might not be kind of walking out kind of thing. So these kind of, street murals or home murals became a huge part of kind of community pride during the Troubles. It also was a way of kind of sending a message to the opposition that, hey, this is our turf, you stay out. And again, a lot of this neighborhood segregation still exists today, and a lot of this artwork still exists today, sending that same kind of message. So you see these are all pro-Irish neighborhoods, pro-IRA banners. The other thing too about the IRA and these paramilitary groups in general that made the Troubles so difficult for legitimate government to kind of overcome was that these were people that again blended in with the local population, that were supported by the local population, that the local population viewed these guys as, champions of their cause, or freedom fighters. And so, like we see insurgents all over the world, they would blend in with the population. They would be supported by the population. They would carry out attacks, but then they would just kind of slink back into the shadows again. And it made it very, very difficult to actively stomp out these groups whatsoever. This is a banner, and this one probably dates from probably the 1980s by the look of it. But something like this would have been, again, very, very common to find in these different neighborhoods throughout Northern Ireland. And again, kind of speaks to the strength of these paramilitary groups and the influence of these paramilitary groups. So this is one that would have been posted in an Irish neighborhood. And you see it says, "Loose talk costs lives," in the taxis, on the phones, in clubs and bars, at football matches, at home, with friends, anywhere. Whatever you say nothing. So, hey, if you see a bunch of your neighborhood youth, armed with Uzis, wearing camo, and they're going off to kill somebody, you better not say anything. You're either with us or you're against us. And that very much was the mentality of people during this period of time. So on one side, again, you had the IRA as kind of the dominant paramilitary group representing the Irish Catholic population. On the other side, because of course it takes two to tango, the largest single pro-British Protestant paramilitary group was a group called the UVF. And UVF stands for Ulster volunteer force. So, you look at these pictures of UVF fighters, and to me, they look no different than the IRA fighters, right? They're using the same kind of weapons, they're using the same kind of uniforms and gear, but of course, they knew the difference between each other for sure. Now, of course, anytime that also you see the word Ulster, remember, Ulster is the traditional British name for Ulster Plantation, aka Northern Ireland. So if you ever see somebody use Ulster or refer to something as Ulster, that is a pro-British viewpoint. Okay, that's a key sign in terms of who they're talking about here. The UVF, especially since they were reflective of the majority population, because people of British descent make up the majority of Northern Ireland even today. Oftentimes they would do things like parades, as a show of kind of military force and military dominance, and hey, you don't want to mess with us. And this is another one of these kind of remnants that you still see kind of carry over into today's day and age, post Troubles. There's still that kind of animosity. There's still that show of kind of community strength. So again, just some pictures here, some other wall murals. These are probably all from Belfast, for God and Ulster. That was a common rallying cry of the UVF. The other thing that you'll still see today in Northern Ireland very, very clearly, that's kind of become a symbol of these different groups and political identification and ethnic religious identification, is especially the flying of flags. It is very easy in Northern Ireland to figure out what kind of neighborhood you're in. Because, you drive down one street, you will see maybe British flags everywhere. And if you see British flags everywhere, you see, the typical Union Jack flag that you see pictured here, that you are in a pro-British Protestant neighborhood. But if you turn down another street and you see nothing but flags of the Republic of Ireland, the orange, white, and green flag, well, that you're in a Catholic neighborhood. And that, again, is as much a point of kind of community pride currently as it was, back during the Troubles. Again, just a few other murals, some of the more famous murals. You can actually go to Northern Ireland and go to places like Belfast today, and you can take like mural tours as a tourist, and they will actually drive you around from place to place and explain kind of the greater meaning of these different murals and what, paramilitary groups operated in these different areas. So that I always say that's like one of those things on my bucket list, post-COVID. I would love to get there and actually see and kind of learn a little bit deeper about some of the stories behind some of these. This is probably the picture of the single biggest mural in Belfast. It's on one of the main drags. And you see there, it says, you are entering Loyalist Sandy Row, heartland of the South Belfast Ulster freedom fighters. So two things that kind of key us off, or three things that key us off very, very quickly in terms of whose neighborhood this is. Well, we got the mention of Ulster. We also got the British flag up here. And then you have this term loyalist. So that is a reference to the fact that these people are loyal to the crown. They are loyal to the government. They are loyal to the United Kingdom. This one is one of the most incendiary single murals, in Belfast that, again, still exists. And you see it's this honorific depiction of Oliver Cromwell. Well, if you think back to lessons, I mentioned the fact that, Cromwell is generally viewed as like the ultimate villain in Irish history, that he basically comes in and like massacres like a third of the Irish population during his reconquest of the island during the Commonwealth period. So, whereas the Irish hate and vilify the guy, to the British Protestant population of Northern Ireland, hey, he's this great national hero. We love him. We love the things that he did. Now, just to kind of point out one last kind of point of general clarity before we kind of get into this larger discussion here, is that, depending on the source that you look at, or, the oral history that you hear, or, the documentary that you watch, people will oftentimes use a bunch of different kind of synonymous identifiers for these two groups. Okay. So again, the major militant groups are the UVF and the IRA. Religiously, remember, UVF, if you ever hear somebody refer to the Protestant side, that's again what they're talking about, Irish Catholic. In terms of, other identifiers, oftentimes these people call themselves unionists. Okay. So again, pro United Kingdom or loyalist. Oftentimes, people on this side will refer to themselves as Republicans. Okay, again, the Republic of Ireland, or they will refer to themselves as nationalists. And then finally, and this is one that a lot of Americans kind of stumble over, and they're not sure what to refer to the person as. Ethnically, usually somebody who is, Catholic and pro-IRA, even if they are living in Northern Ireland, will identify as being Irish. They're like, hey, we're ethnically no different than the people that live in the Republic of Ireland. We're the same nationality. Yet these people generally will identify as either being British or Northern Irish. So you don't refer to these people as Irish, because they will have serious beef with that designation. Now, as I mentioned, okay, so the Troubles, this period of tit for tat violence, primarily starting in the year 1966. Now, like any period of history, sometimes you get these like kind of distinct starting and stopping points. Sometimes you get kind of like hazy starting and stopping points. And I've seen a lot of articles over the years that kind of debate when did the Troubles truly start? Did it start in 1969? Did it start in 1972? Did it start earlier, like in the 1930s? When did it start? The most commonly cited date, though, is specifically on Easter Day, 1966. So the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. What you had happen on that day was that politically at the time, there had been kind of a growing reunification movement in British Parliament. There had been a lot more discussion and debate about, hey, should we really keep Northern Ireland as part of the UK? Should we start, having some discussion about, remerging it with the Republic of Ireland? So that discussion was happening. It wasn't getting a ton of traction, but it was happening. And there had also been a number of bills specifically proposed before Parliament to those ends. Well, because of kind of this shifting political climate, the UVF on that 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, this day of kind of, Irish national pride, the UVF started to carry out on purpose a series of political assassinations against IRA members or IRA supporters, and they do so all over Northern Ireland. It was this purposely incendiary kind of set of actions. Basically, what the UVF was trying to do was they were trying to destabilize, a peaceful process. They were trying to destabilize any kind of democratic discussion, and this is something that frankly we see a lot with radicals around the world. We've seen this with things like the Arab-Israeli, conflict, and we'll get into that a lot more later on this year, where it's like any time that it seems like, the Israelis and the Palestinians are kind of getting to the point of peace, oftentimes it's your most extreme kind of radical fringe people that are then going to commit violent acts because they don't want peace to happen. They want to derail that peace process. Well, thus is what happens on Easter Day, 1966. Same kind of thing. You can't have a peaceful transfer of power if you have warfare in the streets. So they start these killings. The IRA then responds back against them. And it's one of these things where like the ante constantly kind of has to be raised, right? Like you get 2 of our guys, so we go kill 5 of your guys. And so we kill 5 of your guys. So you come back and you like blow up and set, on fire like a whole, one of our neighborhoods. And it keeps escalating and escalating and escalating. Now, I want to show you just a quick clip of what would have been, very typical during the Troubles in terms of kind of news headlines, in terms of actions and events. Again, the best way to think about this is it's a period of pronounced terrorism. Terrorist attacks after terrorist, a lot of bombings, a lot of assassinations, a lot of arson attacks. Also, just a lot of kind of like urban warfare in the streets between these militant groups. So there is lots of similar kind of videos out there on YouTube. You type in the Troubles, there's all sorts of compilations. But this one I found I thought was pretty decent, so I just want to share it with you really quick.
Whole communities were uprooted. Still sore. In the 6 months before, the IRA killed 10 soldiers. In the 6 months after, it killed 40. Long war loomed. July 1972, when the IRA ceasefire broke down.
It looked and sounded very much like the end of the ceasefire. The army are up here in the middle of Lenadoon Avenue. They'd come to a confrontation down the end, which looked at the time like the kind of civil rights clash we knew from years ago.
As the fields went out, with thousands of people packing the cemetery to stay down and calm down, more grenades were thrown. On the far side of the car, the driver, pistol in hand, began to get out. He was set upon.
All right. So, like you said, that hopefully just gave you a little bit more of a visual flavor of what would have been very, very normal during that 30-something year period of time. And again, you watch those scenes, and it's like, to me, I watched those scenes, and at least for the first time, I remember thinking like, wow, is this like scenes from like, the former Yugoslavia when that country broke up? Or is this like some third world country? But then the thing that you have to remember is that, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is a co-equal part of that country, the same way that Wales, Scotland, or England is. So we are talking a country that we tend to view as, this very stable, democratic, very prosperous nation. And yet this was the norm for much of, very modern history. Now, in terms of, just the scale of the violence. So again, a lot of people say, okay, it starts 1966. By the 1969, it is just complete and total chaos, warfare in the streets. So in that year, the British government authorizes the dispatching of the British military to Northern Ireland. Basically the institution of some level of like martial law. And that British military mission, which was called Operation Banner, then lasts for 37 years all the way until 2007. So it's not until 2007 that all these troops are withdrawn from, Northern Irish cities and villages, etc. Now, when the British military was in Northern Ireland, I mean, basically what they did was they set up things like checkpoints. So they would always make sure, okay, who are you? Where are you coming from? Do you have a reason to go into that neighborhood to try to prevent attacks? In many cities, they would set up things like watchtowers to constantly be on the lookout for, militant activity. They instituted things like curfews. They would do raids, on the homes of suspected militants and arms raids. And, they would try to do things like defusing bombs. They were a real significant presence in the daily lives of people in Northern Ireland for really the duration of the Troubles. Now, at least at first, whenever the British military was dispatched, at least at first, many Irish people kind of welcomed, this troop posting, because they thought, like, okay, this is gonna, protect us. This is gonna protect us from these UVF attacks and these UVF, arson and everything else. But very quickly, that kind of viewpoint very much soured, in part because of kind of British military heavy-handedness. And probably the most significant example of this is kind of an early turning point in the Troubles. Probably what you could say is probably the most single famous incident of the Troubles altogether, was a day that has become known as Bloody Sunday. And Bloody Sunday, as I put here on this slide, happened on January 30th, 1972. The context of the event was that basically what you had was a peaceful protest march by Irish Catholics in the city of Derry. Derry is the second largest city in Northern Ireland, and basically they were protesting, again, British troop presence. They were protesting what they thought was favoritism toward these Protestant militant groups, and the fact that the British military wasn't cracking down hard enough on some of these groups. And so, for the most part, this protest was made up of young students, young intellectuals, people that were generally not involved in the paramilitary groups whatsoever. So there was like no IRA presence here at all. Well, the story is that, this had been a sanctioned protest, and the plan was that they were going to kind of march through this predetermined route, and that they would kind of go through town, holding their banners, and that they would eventually kind of turn around, and eventually everybody would go back home. Well, somewhere along the parade march, the group ends up kind of veering off of this preordained route, and they head down like a side street in the direction of a Protestant neighborhood. Well, when they get to this kind of side street, the British military had formed up, in an attempt to kind of keep the peace, keep the two groups apart, and basically told them, hey, you need to disperse. You're on the wrong track. Well, the people start, chanting. The people don't immediately comply. And so within literally a matter of like 2 minutes, this group of British paratroopers goes from warning them to opening fire with live rounds. And when all is said and done, within about a half an hour time altogether, something like 14 people end up being killed. So unarmed civilians are killed. They wound 12 additional people. And out of the 14 people that were killed, 7 of the people that were killed were teenagers, so people your age. And out of those 7 teenagers, 5 of them were shot in the back. So this was a single incident that made, again, international news, really kind of painted the British government in a bad light, and really made it so that, the Irish population as a whole started to view the British military as much of an enemy as they viewed the UVF. And after Bloody Sunday in particular, we see a huge amount of IRA attacks on British soldiers. Altogether, I came across a statistic that said, during the Troubles, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,400 British soldiers were killed primarily by IRA attacks during that period. And most of those, again, were post Bloody Sunday. So these are actually both pictures from the Troubles, from IRA-held areas, and they would put these signs up: "Sniper at work." and they would post snipers to kind of high elevation points. And then if they saw, a British Army patrol or whatever, typically they would open fire. So that just kind of shows you the strength of these groups, how much sway that they had, that they could put threats out like that pretty much wherever they wanted to. Another, really famous kind of example, or another famous event during the Troubles was something that happened in 1981. And specifically, it was the death of the man that you see pictured here on this mural, a man by the name of Bobby Sands. And Bobby Sands, the story of him was that remember, at this point, Northern Ireland, they have seats in Parliament. Okay, so Catholic neighborhoods, they get to elect their representatives. Protestant neighborhoods, they get to elect their representatives. So Bobby Sands was actually a Catholic representative of Parliament. Okay, so he was an MP. He was somebody that had legitimate political authority. He was generally peaceful in his approach. And he was somebody that he had gone and taken part in a kind of unsanctioned protest march, and he was arrested. And he was arrested with a number of other kind of well-connected, wealthy, non-violent people. And when these people were put in jail for taking part in this protest march, Bobby Sands and some of these other guys went on a hunger strike, and they ended up all starving themselves to death in Northern Irish prison. And so that became this big worldwide news story. And Bobby Sands specifically became a kind of martyr for the cause from the Irish perspective. Something like 100,000 people ended up showing up to his funeral. And so again, today, you travel to the Republic of Ireland, you travel to Irish Catholic neighborhoods in Northern Ireland, and you will find his kind of, memory celebrated as this main hero. Now, eventually where things start to kind of slowly improve is that as we get into the 1980s, I think that after, almost 15 years of just constant bloodletting, that both groups start to realize that, hey, violence isn't going to get anybody anywhere, right? That both sides are dying, both sides are suffering. I mean, by this point, the economy of Northern Ireland is also in shambles, because who the heck is going to come in and open a business in a war zone? Who's going to invest in an area that's a war zone? So everybody was kind of feeling the pain of this period of conflict. And so what we start to see in the 1980s is that the IRA really starts to actively promote its political wing. Okay, a faction called Sinn Féin. So that's what you see up here at the top. That's how you pronounce that, Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin, was the largest political party in the Republic of Ireland, but they also were this kind of political party affiliated with the IRA in Northern Ireland as well. And so basically what the IRA does is that they kind of, step back some level of attacks, and they enter into some level of diplomatic discussions with the British government, with the Republic of Ireland's government, with the UVF. All of this goes on, in secret during much of the 1980s, that they're trying to hammer out a comprehensive deal to kind of bring about the peace. Now, of course, while this is happening, more radical militants are kind of seeing the lessening of violence, they're seeing the improvement of conditions, and they're trying to disrupt things. So I'm not going to click on it because just for the sake of time, but if you're interested in the topic, I do have some additional links in the PowerPoint here that you can go back and check out, or there's lots of links on YouTube that show some of this as well. So in that one clip that I just showed you, there's a scene where it showed all these people at a funeral. And all of a sudden, a guy runs up with a grenade and starts lobbing grenades into this crowded, funeral gathering at a cemetery. Well, that was one example of many shocking examples of attacks on civilians that was done to try to purposely derail this peace process that was kind of slowly transpiring behind the scenes. Now, eventually where this is going to bear fruit, and it's going to take a while, there's still going to be fighting, there's still going to be killing, is in 1994, eventually you get, our government involved. And our government kind of steps in as an impartial third-party mediator and helps hammer out a ceasefire agreement. UVF, you guys promise that you're not going to shoot anybody. IRA, you guys promise that you're not going to shoot anybody. And they get like, I think it's like the top like 8 major political paramilitary factions in Northern Ireland all agree in 1994 that, hey, we're not going to kill each other. We're not going to do any kind of revenge killings. We're not going to do any attacks, because we're going to try to finalize this peace deal once and for all. We're if we can just get a prolonged period of peace, we're sure that we can hammer this out. Well, I want to share with you then an advertisement that aired on public television in Northern Ireland during that period after the ceasefire was signed, because it was a really tenuous period. A lot of people were kind of like, well, there had been ceasefires in the past and they'd always failed, or there had always been violence that broke out. And then, next thing you know, everybody's killing each other again. But this particular advertisement is something that is oftentimes cited as being something that kept the peace, that allowed for the eventual end of the Troubles. And specifically what it is it's an advertisement for a government tip line. So an anonymous tip line. So if you knew somebody, who was carrying out a paramilitary attack, you knew somebody who was involved in something, you knew about an attack that was coming, you could call this tip line, and then authorities would go and arrest the person before they could disrupt the peace. So I want you to watch it for a second. I've always thought it's a super powerful message that it's sending. And it was a message that really very much kind of resonated with the population of Northern Ireland during this period. So you can see this from 93. So this is right before the ceasefire was signed. And yes, this is from television right after an episode of Mr. Bean.
Child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way. But there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking before I knew it. And as he grew, he'd say,
"Oh, come on. You gotta be kidding me. Middle of a screencast. You gotta freeze on me."
I'm gonna be like you, Dad. I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon. Little boy blue and the man in the moon. When you coming home, Daddy, don't know when, but we'll get together then. Well, my son turned 10 just the other day. He said, thanks for the ball, Dad, come on, let's play. Can you teach me to throw? I said, not today, I got a lot to do. He said, that's okay, and he walked away, but his smile never dipped. It said, I'm gonna be like him. I'm gonna be like him. Well, I've long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day. I said, I'd like to see you, if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I could find the time. You see, my new job's a hassle and the kids have the flu. But it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon.
Don't suffer it. Change it. Call the confidential telephone.
When you're coming home, son, I don't know when. We'll get together then.
3 phones, 0800 666 999. Anything you know can help.
Gonna have a good time then.
So every time I watch that, that kind of just gives me the chills. Obviously it's set to that famous song, that heart-wrenching song by Harry Chapin about, the relationship between a dad and his kid, and how his dad or the kid kind of just grows up so fast, and the dad's always been too busy. Well, basically you kind of watch that, and it tells the story of this dad who had been involved in some, paramilitary group. And so when his son was young, dad was in prison. Like there was that one scene where you see the guy wearing a white shirt and he's like wearing jeans, and he's in this, like, he's basically in a prison visiting room. So he's in and out of prison. He's running around with his different, buddies that are in these groups as well. So he's not raising his son. And then it kind of fast forwards to the point where, the dad has kind of grown up and reformed himself and is living like a normal life. And what do you see? You see kind of the next generation carrying out the same level of hatred, the same level of violence. And of course, then, the kid ends up being killed. And but he also had killed somebody else basically in front of that person's child, thus, ensuring that the next generation, the third generation, is going to, be engendered with the same level of hatred against them. So, it ends with that whole thing. If you know anything, just please call, don't suffer, change it. Anything can help. So it was something that resonated. It was something that worked. A lot of people did call in, report on these tip lines, and it did help hold the peace. Now, eventually the peace agreement then that was hammered out was something then that becomes known as the Good Friday Agreement. Because it was signed off on Good Friday. It was an international treaty that, again, was agreed by Great Britain, was agreed by the Republic of Ireland, was agreed on by these major militant groups. And basically it did a number of kind of really important things. First of all, it explicitly acknowledged for the first time that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. It would remain part of the United Kingdom unless a majority of the population wanted something else. And of course, the demographics have not changed since 1998. People of British descent are still the overwhelming majority there. So basically it said, hey, status quo is going to be status quo. And for the first time, Ireland, Republic of Ireland specifically, says, hey, we acknowledge that this is going to be a separate country. Second point, though, is kind of what's meant to be a way to assuage more militant Irish Catholics, is that they did offer up, dual citizenship to those people that wanted it. So if you're living in Northern Ireland and you're an Irish Catholic, you could have both the citizenship of the UK and the citizenship of the Republic of Ireland. And that way you could easily move and transport back and forth across their border, no problem. Third thing that it did was it set up a kind of new constitution or new government for Northern Ireland that guaranteed proportional representation within the legislature. And it guaranteed at least some level of seats for all of the major political factions. So, Sinn Féin was guaranteed, X number of seats. Okay. Some other more maybe moderate Irish Catholic group, it guaranteed X number of seats. So basically what it does is it creates a political situation where it can't just be, people of British descent dominating everything, that they're forced to pretty much work with these Irish Catholic parties to get kind of any law passed, that everybody has to kind of be on the same page and at least agree or negotiate for things to happen. I put down to the last bullet that with this, they also created what they called a weakened executive branch. So instead of having one president in the here in the United States, it's like this really strong executive branch and has all this power and authority. Instead, they create a extremely weakened executive branch that is mostly dominated by the cabinet. Okay, so you have somebody that's called a first minister. Okay, so kind of like their president or their prime minister, but he doesn't have unchecked power. Instead, he shares power with all these other people in his cabinet. There's a second minister, there's a minister of health, there's a minister of education, there's all these other people, and basically those have to also be reflective of these different political parties and political factions as well. So again, it's a way of trying to ensure that the Irish Catholic population is represented. And then finally, and probably most importantly for ending the formal troubles, is that these main 8 militant groups all signed off on the disarming of their groups, that we're going to turn in our weapons, we're going to decommission our fighters, that we're going to give up this kind of armed struggle. And so both the UVF and the IRA basically disband. Now, I say that, but the thing is that, again, there were dozens upon dozens of smaller groups. There are people that maybe went along with this that have since renounced this many years later. So it's not a perfect peace, but at least gets the vast overwhelming majority of militants to kind of change their ways. And then I put up there the reference to the fact that, okay, they signed this treaty, but then before the treaty went in effect, they also then put it up for public referendum in Northern Ireland. So they had a big vote. And if the majority of the population want this and vote for this, then it's going to happen. If the majority don't vote for it, then we're back to the drawing board again. And in that vote, 71% of the population voted for the Good Friday Agreement. So it just kind of reflected the fact that so many people had struggled, so many people had lived through extreme hardship during this period. Again, the toll economically, the toll in terms of things like unemployment and alcoholism, not counting the thousands upon thousands of deaths and billions of dollars worth of property damage. For the most part, people were on board with trying to have a more peaceful way forward. So 1998 generally viewed as the end of the Troubles, but a question that still lingers to this day is, are the Troubles really over? Can you just eliminate that hatred with the signing of one treaty?